In June 1812, Napoleon marched 600,000 men into Russia. It was the largest army Europe had ever seen. Soldiers from 20 nations crossed the river Niemen in 3 days. 6 months later, fewer than 40,000 of them marched back out. 19 out of every 20 men were gone forever. They were not destroyed by any single great battle. This is the story of the army that marched itself to death. Welcome to History Unwound. By 1812, Napoleon ruled almost all of Europe. Only Britain still fought him, safe behind its navy. So Napoleon tried to strangle British trade instead. He ordered every port in Europe closed to British ships. Tsar Alexander of Russia quietly refused to obey. Russian ports stayed open, and Russian grain kept sailing. Napoleon decided to punish the Tsar with one short, crushing war. He gathered more than 600,000 men from 20 nations. French men marched beside Poles, Italians, Germans, Dutchmen, and Austrians. They brought 200,000 horses and more than 1,000 cannons. On June 24, 1812, the army crossed the Niemen into Russia. The crossing alone took 3 days on 3 wooden bridges. Napoleon expected one great battle within 3 weeks. His wagons carried food for barely a month of marching. Win fast, force a peace, and be home before winter. The plan had no second chapter if the Russians refused to fight. Russia is very large, and the Russians knew it. The Russian armies simply refused to give Napoleon his battle. They retreated east, day after day, week after week, and as they went, they burned everything behind them. Crops, barns, bridges, and whole villages went up in smoke. The French advanced into a country stripped completely bare. The summer of 1812 was brutally hot. Men marched 20 miles a day through choking dust. The wells were fouled or empty, and bad water made men sick. Dysentery and typhus began tearing through the columns. Horses ate the unripe green rye and died by the tens of thousands. The supply wagons fell far behind on the terrible Russian roads. Soldiers began to starve in the middle of summer. Thousands deserted, and thousands more simply lay down and died. By August, the army had lost 100,000 men without a battle. At Smolensk, the Russians finally stood and fought for 2 days. The city burned, and the Russian army slipped away in the night. Napoleon stared at the ashes and made his choice. Moscow lay 200 miles deeper inside the trap. In September, the Russians finally stopped at a village called Borodino. Their new commander, Old Marshal Kutuzov, would give Napoleon his battle. The Russians dug earth forts across the road to Moscow. On September 7, 1812, 250,000 men collided there. The French threw themselves at the Russian earthworks all day long. More than 1,000 cannons hammered both armies from morning until dark. The great redoubt changed hands again and again at terrible cost. By nightfall, around 70,000 men were dead or wounded. It was the bloodiest single day of all the Napoleonic wars. Napoleon held the field, but refused to send in his imperial guard. The Russians pulled back in good order, bloodied but not broken. 1 week later, the French marched into Moscow. Napoleon waited on a hill for the city's leaders to surrender it. No one ever came out to offer him the keys. Moscow stood nearly empty, its people gone with the army. That very night, fires broke out all across the city. The Russians had carried off every fire pump before they left. Driven by the wind, the flames burned for 6 straight days. 3/4 of Moscow burned to the ground. From the ashes, Napoleon wrote to the Tsar and offered peace. He wrote again, and then he wrote a 3rd time. Alexander never answered a single letter. Napoleon waited in the ashes of Moscow for 5 full weeks. He was sure the Tsar would crack, and the Tsar did not. On October 19th, the army finally turned for home. Almost 100,000 men left Moscow dragging carts piled with loot. The Russians blocked the fresh southern road at Maloy Yaroslavets. Napoleon was forced back onto the same road he had already stripped bare. The first snow fell on the 5th of November. Then the real cold came, down to -20 and beyond. The men had summer coats, broken boots, and almost nothing to eat. Horses fell by the thousands, and the men ate them where they dropped. Without horses, The cannons and wagons were abandoned in the snow. Soldiers froze to death, sitting upright around their dead campfires. Cossack riders circled the column, cutting down anyone who fell behind. The road home was lined with the army's own dead from the summer march. Men trudged past the bones of comrades who had died on the way in. Discipline dissolved, and regiments melted into mobs of starving men. At Smolensk, the survivors found the supply depots already stripped and looted. A shrinking rearguard fought off the Russians mile after frozen mile. Marshal Ney was cut off and led his last men out across river ice. Ahead of them all lay one final obstacle, a river called the Berezina. The Berezina should have been frozen solid in late November. Instead, a sudden thaw had turned it into a flood of drifting ice. 3 Russian armies were closing in from the north, the south, and the east. The only bridge across had already been burned by the Russians. Napoleon's engineers found a shallow ford near a village called Studienka. 400 Dutch engineers waded chest-deep into the freezing river. Working in shifts, they built 2 narrow bridges on trestles driven into the riverbed. Most of those engineers died from the cold within days. On November 26th, the army began to cross. Desperate fighting raged on both banks to hold the Russians back. For 2 days, men, guns, and wagons streamed over the swaying planks. The bridges broke again and again, and the engineers went back into the water. On the morning of November 29th, the bridges were set on fire. Thousands of stragglers were still waiting on the far bank. Some ran into the flames, some onto the ice, and few survived. The army had escaped, but it had almost ceased to exist. In early December, the cold sank to -35 degrees. The Grande Armée was now a shuffling column of frostbitten ghosts. On December 5th, Napoleon abandoned his own army in the snow. He raced for Paris by sledge, wrapped in furs, traveling day and night. A coup attempt had shaken Paris, and his throne came first. Marshal Murat was left behind to lead the survivors out. In mid-December, the remnant staggered back across the frozen Niemen. Fewer than 40,000 soldiers were still fit to fight. Of 600,000 men, barely 1 in 20 came home whole. 500,000 men were dead, captured, or simply missing. Of 200,000 horses, almost none ever came back. Napoleon had not lost one single great battle in Russia. He lost to distance, weather, hunger, and a Tsar who simply waited. The myth that Napoleon could not be beaten died in the snow. Within a year, Prussia, Austria, and Russia were all marching on France. Waterloo was only the epilogue. Russia was the wound. What battle should we deep dive next? Tell us in the comments. Remember to like and subscribe, and always don't let history be forgotten.